Erstklassisch mit Mischke, der musikalische Podcast des Hamburger Abendblatts.
Herzlich willkommen bei einer neuen Folge von Erstklassisch mit Mischke. Wieder sind wir nicht in der Redaktion, sondern diesmal wieder backstage in der Elbphilharmonie in einer Garderobe. Mein Gast heute ist William Christie, ein französischer Barock-Spezialist, der aus den USA kommt, der heute Abend in der Elbphilharmonie mit seinem Ensemble Les Arts Florissants ein Jubiläums-Konzert gibt zum 40. Geburtstag des Orchesters, und wir wollen dann, denke ich mal, hauptsächlich über Barock sprechen, aber nicht nur. Mr. Christie, thanks very much for having me and welcome in Hamburg again.
Thank you very much.
The first thing that came to my mind asking you was, what is so special for you about French Baroque music? Why not Italian Baroque music? Why not German Baroque music? What's the point in French?
Well, first of all, it's the language. And language determines how music is written, essentially, especially in an age when I think vocal music and music with text was considered to be so important as it was back in the 17th and 18th centuries. So French music is very special because it's sung in French. And if you say it's sung in French, it means it's played in French. Because essentially Baroque music as well acknowledged the fact that the voice was the principal instrument and the most important instrument.
But did you sort of give German music a try and said, oh no, that's too German for my taste, that's too effective, that's too strict?
First of all, German music is not too strict.
Okay.
I mean, after all, Bach is one of the most sentimental composers that I know. Mm-hmm. All you have to do is listen to a Bach Minor Mass or Johannes Passion to feel that Bach is not the least bit severe at all. Mm-hmm. He has some wonderfully sort of intellectual ideas about counterpoint, but that doesn't prevent him from being very human.
I see.
I think when people think of me, they think of French music because essentially I was perhaps, along with others, of course, we sort of gave some new life to French music. But you can't be a Baroque interpreter and avoid Bach, mm-hmm. or avoid Monteverdi, or avoid Handel. Or what have you. Mm. French music has been a great love of mine, obviously, because I say I like French culture, I like the French music, I like French art, I like the French language. Mm-hmm. And it's true that French music stands apart in many ways, also because of harmony. What's the difference? Is there some kind of kinship between Ravel and Rameau? Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. And you can hear it in, actually, the harmony, in the colors that, of course, it's presenting to its audience. Mm-hmm.
What was it like when you started? You came as an American to France, and you tried to bring the French the idea of doing this music. I could imagine that not every Frenchman was really happy to be taught by an American what their own history was about.
Could you imagine me coming into mid-19th century Germany, let's say, sort of Leipzig and Mendelssohn, and I'm English, mm-hmm. or I'm Spanish, and I'm saying to them, you really should look out for Bach, he's not bad.
But how was it like? I mean, was it really tough in the beginning, or was it quite easy because nobody really cared about this music and you were the first one to acknowledge that again? Or what was it like?
I think it's a complicated issue, actually. I mean, I arrived 2 years after May of '68, mm-hmm. which in a sense I think was a cultural and social upheaval. It was a revolution in many ways. And I think that culture came out of this extraordinary moment very well. First off, because the French realized that there were other people in the world aside from the French.
Mm-hmm. What a surprise.
Culturally speaking. Of course they acknowledged the fact, that Wagner was the greatest composer of the 19th century, perhaps. But yes, yeah. Or they'd say silly things like, we French are not terribly musical. We're literary, as if to say Debussy and Massenet and Berlioz, well, they're just accidents, you see. And they probably benefited more from liking German music so much. So yes, in 1968 something did happen, and they started, I think, to realize that they belonged to the world. That yes, perhaps people like me who come and worship in Paris, at the feet of all the French gods that I love, yes, we perhaps had something to say that perhaps was more important than what they were saying, you say. That's one aspect. And so therefore I was well received.
I see.
But there's also the idea too that they have so much culture, the French, that, when someone comes and helps pick them up, pick the bags up, the culture bags, and helps them to the train station, and they like that, you see. It's essentially, it's that role that France has played for many, many years of yes, it's being the best, and if Americans come to France, it's to be essentially to bask in this wonderful culture française. Were there people who were not very nice? Yes.
What happened?
Well, it's very simple. It's the same thing that would happen at the Juilliard School in New York, or it would be the same thing at one of the big Hochschulen, in Germany. It would be the same thing. Yes, it essentially it amounts to what I'm about to say. It is essentially we have evolved our way of treating early music. And we don't need yours.
We don't need foreigners to explain that.
No, it's not even a question of foreigners. It's a question essentially of saying we have a conservatory, where we train the best musicians in the world. And we play this music, the music of the 17th century and the 18th century, which we don't really like too much. We play it as we would the music we do like. In other words, we play them on modern instruments, and we play them as if it were Debussy, or why not, or Ravel, The same way, for example, that Karajan, when he was conducting, the Weihnachtsoratorium.
800 musicians.
So, yes, of course. And what was he really thinking about?
I have no idea.
Well, he was thinking about the people he really loves, That's to say the post-dramatics. Why shouldn't we make Bach sound a little bit like Richard Strauss, after all? There is musical evolution. This was the big thing. So essentially the French Conservatoire would take a look at me in 1970 and say, he's like a vegetarian, he's like a vegan, or, he's playing these funny instruments, because he can't play the real ones.
It will pass somehow, they thought.
But this was very much a part of German, the German overview of the new music, the old music movement as well, you say.
One thing that came to my mind as well, thinking back about late 1960s, early 1970s, you also came to Europe because you wanted to evade what's going on in Vietnam. You grew up in an age and in a part of the United States where I wouldn't expect somebody to play harpsichord. I looked up when you were 18. Chubby Checker had this hit, The Twist. Elvis made movies, and you were playing harpsichord in upstate New York. Well, I wasn't actually. I was actually when I was 18. I was in a place called Boston, Massachusetts. Yeah, I know that. I've heard of it. I've been there. But nevertheless, growing up in that period of time, listening to Baroque music, playing ancient instruments, that's completely outside of the box and completely unusual for somebody growing up.
Well, who builds the box after all? You, in this case.
Okay.
Yes.
So it's my box.
It's your box, I'm afraid, yes. It's like someone, a lovely lady whom I met shortly after I moved to Paris in 1970, who had a very fancy dinner party, took me aside and she said, "Now, where are you from?" And I said, "Well, I'm from a place upstate New York called Buffalo." "Oh," she said, "Buffalo, ooh, and how nice." And she said, "But you speak French?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Depuis quand? Well, since when?" And I said, "Well, actually, since I've been a child, actually." "Oh, and what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I play the harpsichord."
The what?
And no, she said, le clavecin.
Uh-huh.
And then she left me, you see. And during the coffee that we were having in the salon after the dinner, she came back to me and she said, now look, you told me that you were from Buffalo, you're American, and you play le clavecin, the harpsichord. And what she was saying was, you're telling me something completely stupid because one cannot do the other, you see. Well, this is something which many Europeans, of course, believe and love, you know. If I told you, for example, that my mother's dinner partners back in the 1950s included Joseph Krips. Yes, remember Joseph Krips?
Yes.
Nice, wie echte Wiener. He was actually conducting the Buffalo Philharmonic.
I see, okay.
Yes. And would you believe, you know, that my lovely mother, whom I owe much to, was directing a small choir in our little Protestant church, you see. And I can remember when I was maybe 10 or so, Mum coming back, and she said, I've just bought something, actually, at the music store. And it was a pastoral for Vanax, for Christmas. And it was by a fellow by the name of Marc-Antoine Charpentier, and it had been edited by someone by the name of H. Wiley Hitchcock. Now, this is in Buffalo, New York, you see. Well, H. Wiley Hitchcock happened to be someone who I then got to know very, very well when I was at Harvard and then when I went off, because he was the great expert in Charpentier. And the fact was, you see, that, yes, I learned about Charpentier when I was 10 years old, you see. So there is the possibility of being able to play the harpsichord in Buffalo, New York.
Okay. What was the first Beatles song you fell in love with?
Actually, I have to tell you that what I really fell in love with, much more importantly, was soul.
Yeah, I've read, you're taking my point away. I've read that you'd like to be reborn as Aretha Franklin in a way.
Well, it could be Diana Ross.
Okay.
It could be Aretha. It could be Sarah Vaughan. You know, and a lot of those ladies, you know, I'd go undergo a hormone treatment, you know, if I were able to sort of, you know, sing like those ladies. My first Beatles, well, you know, the thing is, you know, where was I back when all that was happening? I remember watching the Beatles on the television on the Ed Sullivan Show, where he first presented these Beatles. That must have been way back in the 60s. Or maybe even late 50s, I can't remember. Yes, we followed the Beatles, yes, a great deal. Yes, yeah.
What's the most modern composer you've ever conducted? I mean,
that I've conducted?
Yes, conducted.
In living or dead?
If you have a living one, I'll take the living one as well.
Well, I think the last thing I did with... we did an extraordinary motet by... a still living Franco-American composer by the name of Betsy Jolas. Betsy, who was very much a part of the international musical scene. I met her actually in New York, but she lived in France. And this was a marvelous piece that we did, I think, about 5 or 6 years ago for voices and instruments.
For a few years, you've conducted the Berlin Philharmonic as well. I wonder what it's like for a conductor coming from a Barock-Ensemble, standing in front of this enormous amount of people, more than 100 musicians. Are you blown away by the sheer loudness of that? Or
I was scared shitless.
Really?
Actually, yes. But the fact is, I had been warned, but in a very good way, that I wouldn't have 100 musicians in front of me. I would have the crème de la crème. And they would be people who would be molto simpatico. And I must say... one of the first things that happened was someone came up and said, "Hi, I'm Christoph Wolff's brother, and I'm playing the contrabass." And then there was that another contrabass player, Klaus, who was absolutely extraordinary. And then I remember Hans, who had been I think he had been taken when Karajan was conducting, and he said, "You know, never take the things for granted. We all know Baroque music." And the second or third day, he came in brandishing a Baroque bow, you know. And You see, orchestras like this, and I think probably this was a battle. They've seen every Tom, Dick, and Harry who's come by, you know. They form opinions very quickly. But the fact is, all you have to do is say something once to these people. The technique is fabulous, you know. I just conducted very, very recently the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam. Sure, they can play Mahler and they can play Bruckner, but they can also play Handel. And they can also play Bach. And, you know, Simon Rattle brought me there. And Simon is an extraordinary, very gifted and very humane human being, and I think a great conductor. And he knows as much about Baroque music as many of my Baroque colleagues. And I say that with great admiration. Yes.
Why is there always this atmosphere of a fight about to begin when people start talking about what is right and wrong in playing Baroque music? Because everybody has at least 3 opinions about what is right, what is wrong.
I don't know what circles you've been in to get that kind of impression. What I hear now, you see, and I think I keep my ear to the grindstone. I know what's going on, I think, and certainly I'm involved now with some of the most extraordinary talent in the world amongst the youngsters. You know, I teach at the Juilliard, and we've got, well, all I can say to you is that these are dead issues. Way back, back in the 40s and 50s, you have to cite the chapter and the verse of whatever treatise it was. If you didn't know Agricola or a little bit of Matisson, or that very obscure sort of text, involving you couldn't defend yourself. You see, I think now the most important thing is, with this understanding that with early instruments or with copies of early instruments, you can get a little bit closer to what the composer listened to. And with these instruments that by their very nature and by their very defects, they favor repertoire. You can play Bach better, I think, on a gut-strung fiddle than you can otherwise, in terms of just sound production, and the bowing, of course, is very different. What do people say nowadays? When I say, for example, to Theotim de Swartz, who was one of our young violin players, aged 22 or 23, he said, well, the nice thing about Baroque music is, of course, you can have 10 different people playing the same piece, and it'll be different each time. And if I asked Theotim, well, what does that mean? He said, well, it means that the composer gives much more freedom to the interpreter than perhaps Boulez would. You see, and that, I think that's an important point to make, you see. Yeah.
Can you actually enjoy listening to a Wagner opera 4 hours just in a row, sitting there being overwhelmed by music like that? Or is it something that's just not fit for your system somehow?
I remember saying to myself, yes, the music that gives you the most solace, the most enjoyment, the music that you can live with and is the closest to you is music of the 17th and 18th centuries, And I carried that around as a kind of a guilt thing for a while. But I should be liking, I was a pianist before, I mean, I made my debut playing the first Mendelssohn G minor piano concerto, you see. Why do I not play the Faust scenes from Schumann? Why can I not do the Brahms, the great Brahms songs and I said to myself at one point, it's because perhaps I have to make a choice in life that I can't do everything. What do I play? And you ask me about Wagner, how can you possibly be a feeling musician and not get overwhelmed, by the Ring? Length is not a problem with me, I mean, there are many Baroque operas that are very,
at least 2 days long.
Exactly that. You have to camp out and and bring food. Yes.
That's the whole point of Baroque opera.
Sometimes, yes. No, I've said, and it's partly joking, but it's not partly joking in a sense. There is some truth. In my next life, if I get reincarnated as something other than a pig or whatever.
And not Aretha Franklin.
Well, there'd be Aretha, but I'd be highly tempted to be a conductor, maybe doing Schumann and Schubert. You know, Schubert, I think, is one of the greatest emotional moments of my life. You know, as a Schumann. You see, I'd probably be a German romantic sort of conductor. But then again, Aretha is very tempting. But then. You see, there the input is so important. You see,
we always end up at the Amazing Grace album. I'm really. But is there a sort of composer or a sort of music that really bores you stiff? I talked to Alan Gilbert recently, and he told me he'd never conduct Carmina Burana by Karl Orff. I just applauded because I'm completely his opinion. But
yes, there are moments in musical history that simply just I can't stand. I can start them. Well, let's start with the 20th century. That school around the Honegger and Millot and all that drives me to complete distraction. You know, I can't stand it. You know, and I remember once I was at a dinner party and we were talking about this music, and I said I cannot. It just it makes me ill. You know, to listen to these people. You know, Les Sept and all that. And there was an aged old lady, and she presented her hand out. She said, "Je m'appelle Millot. Madeleine, et j'étais la femme. I'm Madeleine Millot, and I was his wife."
Oh.
But then we can go back on in history. There are moments, for example, in the 18th century, when Gluck comes, he's wonderful. Almost.
Almost wonderful.
Although you have to wade sometimes through pages and pages and pages and pages. And then there's that moment where something hits you like an arrow in the heart, you know. But then after that, someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, oh no, I don't like that very much.
What about Italian bel canto then?
Oh, but some of the bel canto was fabulous. But then again, you can listen to Bellini and go through 35 pages of umpa, 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 umpa. If I were a cello player, I'd commit suicide, you know. But then all of a sudden, one fabulous burst of melody from the soprano, and you think, oh, all right, that's worth it. Do I like Carmina Burana?
I have no idea. Do you?
I hate it.
You hate it. Okay.
I really do hate it. I hate that. You know what? I think there's only one thing that's worse. Is it off? Did the orchestration of some of the Monteverdi back in the 20s? Someone of that ilk, you know, where it becomes swollen and big and horrible and kind of grotesque, like sort of deformed, huge giants, sort of, you know, running around the musical score, you know.
What is it like if you concentrate on making this music? You should also be able to know a lot about the cultural history of the age where it took place. I mean, you have to know about architecture, about French architecture. You have to know about the fashion, the food, the literature. So it doesn't stop knowing your way around the actual music. That's not enough if you want to do it properly.
Well, you said something very true.
Okay.
I was just at an extraordinary exhibit in Vienna, which mates essentially two extraordinary people, Caravaggio and Bernini. And it was about affect, you know. Why do you see, for example, on one wall, 10 paintings of Judith and Holofernes? You know, this charming woman holding a severed head, you know. I mean, God, that's pretty tough. But again, it's violence, it's anger, it's emotion, it's terrible fear, it's awe, it's and if you don't understand that this is the basic premise of Baroque art, including music, you don't know it. Now, having said that, when I get all kind of sort of self-important and think I'm so wise, I say to my students, yes, if you don't know who Molière is, or if you don't know, for God's sakes, if you have a basic knowledge of Italian sculpture or Italian 17th century painting, you're lost. That's true, yeah. But coming up right now, our kids, maybe they're 18, maybe they're 22, they haven't received the classical message. They haven't received the humanist message. They haven't received the idea that somehow the more culture you have, the better musician you're going to be. I've got a couple kids in this orchestra tonight who couldn't, I don't think, place Bernini or Caravaggio in their right century, and yet they're innate, brilliant, and I'd call them almost genius musicians. This is a dilemma. Is it a new dilemma? A bit so. A bit so. Yeah.
I mean, I sort of know my way around Baroque music, but if I were a complete beginner, what would you recommend me to listen to first to fall in love with this music like you did decades ago?
I'd be better equipped, I think, to answer you than by saying, tell me about yourself a little bit, I mean, are you an expansive person? Do you like meeting people? Do you have a sense of solitude? Do you have a sense of exaggeration? Do you get, do you like extremes? And then I'd say, or perhaps maybe you're more meticulous. Maybe you like, the intricacies of a difficult conversation. And then I'd say, if that's the case, why don't you take a look at some Ricercar, or Frescobaldi, or why don't we start with the Out of the Fugue?
Okay, let's pretend I'm socially compatible. I like bright colors, and I'm easily bored. What would you?
Well, then I'd say we've got to sort of get you into Baroque opera very quickly.
Okay.
Yeah. And
but French?
No, by no means.
Oh, by no means.
No, by no means. No. We could put you into one of the hot sort of Monteverdi or post-Monteverdi pieces. I mean, why not start out with something as over the top as the Coronazione di Poppea? And then perhaps if you're visually sort of oriented, well, let's do something with some of the more. How about an early 18th century opera seria, where we can combine some pretty good sort of stage architecture and sumptuous costumes, and a lavish cast of people doing outrageous things vocally and what have you.
And afterwards, lots of wine.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So do you compose your concert programs like a chef composes his menu card?
These are very good questions. Well, tonight, for example, we start out big. But it's a kind of the surprise big. It's the kind of, the door's going to open very slowly, very, very slowly, and we're not quite able to see what's inside. And then, poof! It's the huge cuisine, you see. It's the big kitchen. And then in the middle of the concert, you've got to have a pause, because we've been giving people some very rich dishes, you see. Bits and pieces. You never give them enough. You give them just enough that they want more. And then after a grand moment, we have the sorbet. We have the little sort of, the French would call it, that little sort of, pas de digestif, but, if you go to Normandy, you have that little trou normand, which is a little shot of alcohol. And this is a very quiet piece with one voice and one lute. And people go mad. And then it builds up again. And finally, we have the baume glacé. We have a big baked Alaska that's on fire, and all that. And that's the Anne Galante of Rameau, the volcano scene of the Incas of Peru. You see. So yes, it's designed essentially, I think, first of all, to give pleasure, and it's designed to give enormous variety. And it's also designed to make people, I think, emotionally, to open up their emotions. Yes.
So a good concert takes you or keeps you busy in your mind for much longer than what the actual concert takes
Oh,
at
yeah.
the time.
Oh, yeah. In fact, I've been criticized now by my team because I'm too late now. I'm too late. I have a concert to do, which is going to take us, I think, all around Eastern Europe and perhaps even in Germany, with two extraordinary young ladies, a wonderful soprano and a wonderful mezzo. And yes, I've given them a lot of ideas. But now we've got to sort of, it's the tasting now. We have to sort of, there's too much music. We have to refine it down. We have to, and that's taking a long time in my mind. Yes, It does. Yes, it takes a long time.
One thing that I find admirable and nice in a way, and nice not meaning in a childish way, is the idea that you have this giant garden in the west of France.
You've done your homework.
I've done my homework. I'm really sorry.
Lovely.
But how did this come about? I mean, haven't you been busy enough? Was it like another big passion of yours, or is it just conducting with your gardening equipment, and it's just like music, putting a garden together because it's like putting a piece together? I couldn't make my mind what the reason might have been.
Yeah, I think that there's well, what you just said. There are some aspects that involve both music and gardens. You do, I think, in life, if you're able, and I know it's an enormous privilege and an enormous gift. If you can do what you love, you're already, in a sense, better off than most of humanity. Mm-hmm. And there are two things in my life that I've, aside from, things that are very, very basic, that I've been fortunate enough to have. Music, which is kept, you're never alone with music, really. It's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful solace. It's a wonderful companion, as well as being something you can then give off to other people. But also, when I was very young, I had, you role play and you imitate, and I learned very quickly to love things that grow, gardens, for a number of reasons. I had, first of all, two parents who adored gardens, and two parents who I think could communicate that to their kids. And there was great joy there as well, having a little tiny plot, and not even bigger than that piano there, and being able to plant some bulbs, some tulips and some narcissi and what have you, when I was 6 or 7 years old. That, those kinds of things are very important for you. And when and growing up, nature was very important, incredibly important. Trees are very important for me. And these are things that I learned and I shared with my parents, who were very good about all this.
And I guess gardening teaches you to be patient,
which I'm not
bad for a conductor. Sometimes.
No, which I'm not. But that means to say that I now say yes. Look, okay, fine. I take a look at my garden, which I started this last garden, and I started in 1985, 86, and I was impatient. I made mistakes because of impatience. I wanted to get things going very quickly without thinking as much as I should have. But now the garden is 30-some years old.
And how large is it? I mean, is it like a miniature Versailles, or what's the size?
When you think about a garden in your mind, and I had this garden had been in my mind with obviously things added to it but the garden is I've been thinking about this garden for 40 years or 45 years or more, 50 years maybe. You think big,
okay,
or whether you think that you've got to see exactly. So essentially, what I'm saying is, what am I doing now? Well, sometimes I wake up in the morning and I say to myself, "Oh God, I've just bitten off more than I can chew. The garden's too big. The garden is too expensive. I can't do this garden just by myself and one gardener. I've got to have a fleet of gardeners as big as Versailles."
So it doesn't end at the horizon. I don't know how large is it.
Well, it's actually there's a front garden which is a formal French sort of cour d'honneur, which is full of clipped box and clipped yews, and it's very beautiful. And then there are wonderful fantasies like there's a green theatre. And there's a very large orchard planted in French fashion with beautifully clipped trees and espaliered apples and whatever. And then there's a rear garden which has an enormous topiary, which involves an immense amount of work all around here. And in other words, it's a very, very clipped and worked garden. And the whole is now about... that part's about almost 2.5 hectares, which is a lot of yes. And then it becomes wild, you see. But even the wild areas you have to take care of them, and there are animals, you see, and there are buildings, and then it goes off into the horizon with woods, you see. So the whole thing now, I mean, you can, if you stand on the terrace of the back of the house, you look out first onto this extraordinarily clipped garden of great topiary shapes and all that, and then there's the river with the great the water course, you see, which is it's over 100 meters long, you see, and that's surrounded by plane trees, you see, and then so essentially we're talking about 15 hectares.
So you're not having a garden but a province.
Well, I'm having nightmares sometimes about
But
no, I love it.
Okay.
And of course, now the garden is there for music, you see. And that was another thing that was very important. And you asked me this. Yes, I was thinking about both music and garden for most of my life, aside from a few other things, which we won't get into.
But if you're doing this festival in the summertime, it would drive me crazy if I had all these people trampling in my garden, and I have to take care about it afterwards.
No. You love it for a week.
Uh-huh.
You like it a little bit less after 10 days.
Uh-huh. And then you can't wait for them to get lost.
And then they all leave, you see. And then you're left, and you could walk out into the garden at 8 o'clock in the morning and say, it's mine. Yeah.
Finally, it's mine again.
Yes.
Somehow, Baroque musicians tend to really get involved into large projects. I've talked to Ton Koopman.
Well, Ton is very ambitious as well.
Yeah,
yes.
And he told me that he has he has several houses where he has his library, his books, his prints, and he has, I think it's been 9 harpsichords. So he's a sort of collecting character as well.
Well, indeed. In fact, I think Ton, at last news that I don't see him very often nowadays, but he had a house in France as well, or still does.
Okay.
Yes.
So do people like you swap instruments, or do you compare each other's private passions in, I found this new interesting thing to do, I found this to collect, I found that to take care of?
Well, I was just talking about that today, because we were talking about Hamburg, and Hamburg in the 18th century, and that Bach and Mattheson and Telemann and Handel, of course, belonged to the same society of learned people. And in fact, one forgets this, that Bach was far more sort of international than one believes. It wasn't only Telemann and Handel, who were trading plants and, giving each other tips about whatever, Did that exist in my history, in my life? Well, I had one photo, which God knows where it is. I hope it's in some box somewhere. But it took place in 1974-75 in Saintes, which is a very beautiful town in the western part of France, near La Rochelle, not too far from where I live, actually. And I had rented a house for the festival in Saintes, which began, I believe, in 1974. And I took the photo down, and I was standing on the balcony of my house, and I was overlooking the courtyard. And it was like an almanac de Gotha of all of the Baroque the younger, the new movement. There were Ronnie Jacobs, there was Christopher Hogwood, there was Jordi Savall, there was Ton Koopman, with the first of their many wives, in the case of several, and there they all were, you see, and. Was there a kind of a collegiality? Did I sort of stop off and say hello to Gustav Lehnhardt when I was in Amsterdam, or did I go off to the... yes, I did, as a matter of fact. And I forged some extraordinary friendships then, you see. I think what we did, which was very interesting, almost instinctively, was each one decided on a specialty. Tom was a brilliant harpsichord player, and he liked Bach. And Jordi Savall took care of all the Iberian stuff, and all the all the exotic. And then there was René doing sort of 17th century song and what have you. And we chose composers as we chose repertory and instruments. You see, and I think we're very compatible. I worked for a while with Max van Egmond and up in the north, and with Jordi, and with Emma Kirkby, and with Nigel Rodgers, and it was very international, and we were a bit like nomads, like gypsies.
And you're the American in Paris forever.
Well, I was obliged to travel a great deal. Am I an American in Paris? Yes, I am. Someone asked me if I had any kinship to the Americans of years gone by. I mean, let's face it, every generation since the late 18th century in America seems to have had a few escapees who got themselves to Paris and were never the same since. Great writers. I mean, if you mention people like Hemingway or Edith Wharton, those are the names. I feel that, yes. Yeah.
Do you feel French now, or do you feel? That's my final question. Then we're done. But do you feel French, or do you feel still like being an American exile?
I'm very upset and very uncomfortable right now in France, and first of all because I came to France for a number of reasons. For the war was something terrible for me, the Vietnam War. I remember spending as much time going to demonstrations and sit-ins and protesting and all that. And I remember that awful summer where to stay at Yale University, I had to go off to basic training in the army, just to stay in and then become a member of the reserves. You see, I left the States under a cloud. And for all kinds of, not only the political reasons, but the soldier, but also very personal reasons too. I was struggling essentially with being gay, and that too was an important thing. Did I think it'd be any better in France? No, I didn't. But the fact was, I was just a bundle of uncertainties. I knew what I wanted in terms of my career. I wanted to make music desperately, And I realized, too, that teaching wasn't going to be the answer. I'd been teaching at Dartmouth. So all these mixtures of things took me to France, and I had someone said, do you want to become an honorary Frenchman? I would at that point have said, yes. And I for years, I wore rose-colored, pink-colored sunglasses, Everything in France was wonderful. And I lapped it up. I'd go off to the Église Saint-Gervais and I'd listen to the organ that Couperin was playing in 1720, and I'd go to Versailles and I made wonderful friends, and there is something, an art de vivre in France, which is very, very, very appealing. Today, I'm sick at what I hear and what I see, and I realize, of course, that since I am French now, I either have to accept it as something which historically is just a chronicle problem. The problem essentially is when France is unhappy, it becomes very unhappy. Mm-hmm. And what does France do when it's unhappy? Well, it goes down into the streets. And it's the streets that govern, you see. Am I concerned about this as someone who believes in democracy or as someone who believes in equality? Yes, I am. I'm concerned that there's this rather sort of terrifying aspect of France, too. They're ungovernable, And more than that, there's this incredible, deep-seated desire to keep things always as they are, To drag France now into the 21st century is to drag France screaming and kicking, Mm-hmm. And is Paris a pleasant place to be? No, it's not. I'm sorry to say. Mm. Is that going to last for another month? Perhaps. I have my house. It's fine. I can sort of turn my back on all that, but you really can't turn your back on that. This is not idle and just silly sort of comparisons. You arrive here in Hamburg. First of all, you see a town which is immensely rich. You sense it, but immensely ordered as well. Is this something that I admire in society? People who think before they act, which is not the case in France. Mm. Yes, I do admire that, So I suppose we could finish off by saying, when I'm feeling good about what's around me, and when I think sort of just loftily about French culture and French art, yes, I'm the American in Paris who adores France and has been very, very well treated by French people, and I've learned a great deal. And I suppose it's helped me in a very important way in my music. See? But when I'm not feeling that way, do I feel a little bit American? Well, I have American work ethic, but that's just part of my Protestant background, you see. Do I have American values? Not as much as Am I currently in love with the States and just happy that
I guess not.
Oh my God! It's just talk about scraping the bottoms of barrels, and we're destroying ourselves, but I'm afraid we're destroying part of the world as well. So yes, I suppose I'm happy to be here making music as a Frenchman. Yes.
Okay, that's famous last words. Thank you very much. Das war's für diese Folge. Vielen Dank, William Christie, und ein schönes Konzert.
Weitere Podcasts vom Hamburger Abendblatt finden Sie auf abendblatt.de/podcast.